Welcome back to Purrfect Takes. I'm your host, Stephen Patton, joined as always by my co-host and dear friend, Jacob Acquire. And we told you guys on Tuesday that we would probably be back with more head coaching news and just kind of front office coaching vacancy news this Thursday. And sure enough, we get to talk about the New York Jets' new head coach. They didn't let him get to even interview with the New Orleans Saints. So I'm sure they're very happy the snowstorm kind of kept matters at bay and allowed them to finalize negotiations. I like that he's potentially bringing on Steve Wilks as his defensive coordinator. I don't know if that's been finalized, but definitely a lot of good defensive minds forming up in New York. What are your initial thoughts on this hire? Do you think this is a good move for a franchise that seems to kind of be heading towards a rebuild?
Yeah, for one, I think it's good because I always like when a player comes back to where he played and becomes the coach. It would have been cool if like the Panthers were able to get somebody like that full time, maybe in the future if Luke Kuechly wants to be our defensive coordinator, because we might need one pretty soon. That might be the case, but it seems to be pretty cool. I know Aaron Glenn is really liked around there. And yeah, he already has a strong idea of who he wants his staff to be. So that's always a good sign. But for me, looking at this and looking at the Ben Johnson news we talked about on Tuesday, how many coaches are the Lions going to lose? Because you got to expect both Johnson and Glenn to pick coaches from the Lions staff that they want to take with them. We usually see at least one come and be like one of the new coordinators on the new staff. I feel like the Lions coaches are going to be picked bare by this time next season, and they're going to have a full new team built around them. Reminds me a lot of the Philadelphia Eagles 2 years ago, coming off that Super Bowl. They lost both coordinators, tried to promote from in-house, and then we saw what happened. Both of those guys no longer coordinating the following year.
Yeah, no, and there was a big drop off, and that is something to monitor with the Lions coaching staff, where they head. Obviously, I think Dan Campbell said in his end of year press conference that he expects Jared Goff to weigh in on the decision, at least for the offensive coordinator position. But to your point, they already lost their defensive line coach, Tyrell Williams, who's now the new defensive coordinator in New England, who pairs with Josh McDaniels, their new offensive coordinator. So it seems like the AFC East is pulling a lot of talent away from the Detroit Lions. And it will be interesting to see, like you said, how Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn fill out their staffs, and if there are any other coaches that follow them or leave for other positions. But like you said, whether it's internal promotions or external promotions, the Lions have a big offseason ahead of them.
For sure. And then you just brought up how the Patriots took the D-line coach there, made them their defensive coordinator. They also bring in Josh McDaniels, somebody who's super familiar to be the offensive coordinator, presumably the play caller. I don't think Mike Vrabel is going to be calling plays anytime soon. And I want to know, how is he going to mesh with Drake May, because he obviously worked with Tom Brady for quite some time. He was with Mac Jones for his rookie year. And I think Drake May has a different skill set than both of them. I think his arm is a bit more live than end of career Brady and certainly Mac Jones. And I think he's a bit better of an athlete, like getting outside the pocket. So I want to know how that's going to work with McDaniels. We know he likes to do a lot of quick game, likes to incorporate screens going toward the middle of the field. So I want to know how that's going to mesh. Do you think they're going to be a team that's going to be in on like a T. Higgins or something like that? Because I know they are very, very high in the cap space ranking order. I'm just trying to see how it all comes together. I understand the familiarity part of bringing McDaniels in, but I don't know. I want a more exciting play caller to go with Drake May. But he's not a bad offensive coordinator by any means. He's just a bad head coach.
Yeah, it's there have been those coaches all throughout the league. I like that Ben Johnson kind of reserved taking a head coaching spot to cultivate and develop skills he was going to need to be a head coach that he believes he has going into Chicago. But we've seen guys like Wade Phillips, Steve Spagnuolo. Heck, I think you can argue in the case of guys like Chip Kelly. I think one of the reasons why the Baltimore Ravens offensive coordinator, Todd Monken, hasn't gotten any looks is because those guys are respected for what they do. And sometimes that's really all they should do. And in this case in point, I think Josh McDaniels offers Drake May a baseline in the offense. I think the priority will be fixing the trenches. I'm actually more curious of how they address the offensive line build than necessarily getting a big name like T. Higgins. Because I think if McDaniels can have a good offensive line with Ramondre Stevenson, with some of the tight ends they already have on this team, you can kind of disguise run and pass looks to where you're giving Drake May some deep shots downfield, aside from the quick passing game we may see Josh McDaniels ask of Drake May. I think it was very interesting that when Josh McDaniels had the opportunity of working with Cam Newton for a brief stint before they drafted Mac Jones, that they incorporated some design quarterback runs. And I don't think we saw a lot of that with Drake May. I think he has the ability to, like we see with a Josh Allen and even like the Cam Newton example provided. So seeing that step and progression, I think is going to be key so that they evolve in the modern time and they aren't outdated with an older NFL offensive system.
Yeah, I could see them going for like a Trey Smith from the Chiefs. He's going to be a free agent this year. Not sure if the Chiefs can afford to keep him because there are going to be a lot of O-line needy teams like hunting for his services. We saw what Robert Hunt got in the offseason. Got to expect Smith to get more than that. And teams like the Bears are probably going to go after him, the Patriots. So that could be the move for them. Kind of on a personnel front, like the guy who goes out and looks at free agents, signs free agents. We have some news that came in earlier, and that was that Trent Baalked, Shad Khan's right-hand man, who has picked like 3 coaches for them now. How many for the Niners? Like 3 or 4 for the Niners.
Yep.
Has finally been let go by the Jags. And just to talk about Baalked, everybody rags on him. The last time that a team that he put together, engineered, won more than 9 games, so double-digit games, was back in 2013 with Jim Harbaugh. He fired Harbaugh the next year for going 8-8. And ever since then, it's been a downward spiral wherever he's been. The draft picks don't tend to pan out. He hired Urban Meyer to pair with a rookie and Trevor Lawrence. Obviously didn't work out. Trayvon Walker over Aiden Hutchinson. You can go on. And now I think the biggest infraction on his negative resume, you could say, is that he prevented, like his presence alone prevented Ben Johnson, Liam Cohen, some of the high-end head coaching prospects from even wanting to be there. And now that Ben Johnson's already taken the Bears job, now that Cohen is reportedly back with Tampa for another year as their play caller on offense, Shad Khan finally fires Baalked when literally everyone could see that he was the problem. This started back 2 years ago when they hired Doug Peterson, when Byron Leftwich, like not a folk hero, but like a local legend, he was quarterback for the Jacksonville Jaguars, said, I'm not going to coach there if Trent Baalke's the GM. And Shad Khan said, okay, whatever, we'll just get somebody better. And then Doug Peterson turned out to be pretty bad for him. You didn't know then that he was the problem, but at least now, finally, there's some responsibility being taken. But you can't help but wonder if it was too late. Like, who's going to be the head coach there now?
Well, you got to consider that there are still several teams that are in the playoffs that have potential candidates. I would be intrigued to see. Cliff Kingsbury said he would not jump on a head coaching opportunity unless it was a really good one. And I think with Baalked out the door, maybe that's an avenue for him to take a head coaching position with a former first overall quarterback, some good pieces to work with on offense, and some promising pieces on defense. But to your point about Baalked going back to even San Francisco and then his time with Jacksonville, this is a guy that overpays on free agents and goes for traits over just finding football players. As much as I think the analytics community kind of ragged on Brad Holmes this past offseason for saying he drafts football players, I think that's something that Baalked missed in his evaluations. Sometimes it's not getting the guy with the long arms. It's getting the guy that gets to the quarterback and finishes the play. And I think that's the difference between a guy like Trayvon Walker and Aiden Hutchinson. And the film showed that in college, and it's shown that since here in the pros. So it's just that misevaluation from the general manager side. And then from a head coaching standpoint, yeah, who's going to want to take that job? Right now, it looks like Robert Saleh is the front runner for it. And I think he was done dirty by the New York Jets, and they slid defensively once he was fired. They weren't the same. And I think that's just a testament to what he brought to the locker room. And if he's able to team up with a good offensive coordinator, there's a chance they could turn things around in Jacksonville. I'm a little skeptical about it just because it is the Jacksonville Jaguars, and the fact that it took Ben Johnson and Liam Cohen going, nah, I'm good, for them to fire Baalked, when the Raiders, the second they heard Ben Johnson had really no interest in coming into a situation with a pre-existing general manager and getting tied to a bad situation. The Jaguars didn't do anything then, and it wasn't until they lost out on their top candidate that they realized, oh, maybe we made a mistake. And so for the longest time, I thought Shad Khan, like Trent Baalke, had blackmail on him. I was like, there's no way that this guy is still a general manager when it's turning some of the better candidates in this coaching pool completely away.
Yeah, I guess sometimes billionaires just aren't the smartest people. Who would have thought? But you talk about the Raiders. We can kind of pivot to them next. And they fired Tom Telesco, the GM, because, like you said, Ben Johnson didn't want to be tied down to a GM. Ironically, he goes to the place with the pre-existing GM out of all the places that ended up firing theirs. But the Raiders don't have a GM or a coach right now, and they're in the running, or I think it's like almost agreed to that they're going to hire a guy named John Spytek from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as the new general manager. It's funny that Tom Brady would want a guy named Spytek to be his GM, given all the kind of stuff that went on in New England with filming practices and that kind of thing. But I think the relationship exists between Spytek and Brady when Brady was the quarterback for the Bucs. And if they're able to pull that off, maybe they can pry Liam Cohen away and convince him, hey, you don't want to be an OC for another year. Don't sign the contract. Maybe you want to come be a head coach where you have 3 or 4 years to build this thing yourself. That's kind of the thing I'm thinking of with Baalke getting fired recently and all that. Maybe maybe Jacksonville and Las Vegas are trying to pry Liam Cohen away.
I'm not exactly sure. There was a point last offseason where a second interview was scheduled. The Commanders were going to fly out and interview Ben Johnson again. They were very interested in him as a candidate, and he turned them away and said, hey, I'm going to stay with the Detroit Lions. And I think it got to a point where the culture he wanted to build, the direction he wanted to take a franchise, was not in line with that front office. And that's okay. The Commanders are doing well, and I think Ben Johnson's going to do good things in Chicago. So that's not a knock against either side. It's more just to say that I think if there's an offensive play caller that doesn't feel like there's cohesiveness with ownership, with the general manager, I think just doing what you did the year prior that made you successful is sometimes in your best interest. And obviously it didn't work out for Bobby Slowick, but I think Liam Cohen is really in a tier with Ben Johnson. I felt like Bobby Slowick wasn't really in that tier. I thought he was more Dave Canales, some of these other play callers that you probably hold like middle of the league average. And so that disparity, I think Liam Cohen can do really good work for his stock this year in Tampa Bay, building off what he's done in 2024. And I think he stays put. I understand that the Raiders and the Jaguars could make another push. I just don't think he's sold on it. And that's why he signed, or at least agreed to, the contract extension or new contract terms with the Buccaneers.
I don't know. We see plenty of times where a guy waits another cycle and it passes him by. You talked about Bobby Slowick. I mentioned Byron Leftwich earlier. Like, I think you need to strike while the iron is hot. And personally, I don't think Cohen's in the Ben Johnson tier. We've seen Johnson do this year after year, having the offense put out numbers like that. And he has like the clout behind him. You got to remember, this is the third cycle. Ben Johnson's been like the top candidate around the league. I haven't seen Liam Cohen there just yet. Maybe if he waits a couple more years and gets the Buccaneers to the 1 seed a couple times, we'll have to see. But certainly a good candidate in his own right. I think that kind of covers all of the hirings that have gone on over the past 2 days. The teams that still need head coaches and GMs, obviously the Jags, we talked about them. I think they're the big profile team. They need one of each, head coach and GM, since they fired Baalke earlier. And I'm not quite sure how that's going to turn out. I do think Robert Saleh would be good for them, though. Joe Brady, maybe after the Bills. If the Bills get knocked out this weekend, we'll have to see. New Orleans, we still haven't heard a ton from them. I kind of think Mike McCarthy might be a good fit there. We just don't really know because Aaron Glenn, I thought, would be a good fit too because he coached there. He's off to the Jets. Las
Mike
Vegas.
McCarthy was an offensive coordinator for the Saints back in the day. So there's a connection there
Yes.
with that ownership group. And I could see that panning out.
Yeah, the Raiders, like we talked about, still need a if they get the spy tech guy from the Bucks, they'll still need just a head coach. But if that deal doesn't go through, they'll need one of each. Dallas head coach, I think that's another. It's kind of kept on the down low because we're like, oh, Dallas, America's team, right? But they haven't brought in a giant list of candidates. I think they interviewed Kellen Moore once. I don't know if they're going to interview Deion Sanders or not, but they've interviewed Brian Schottenheimer, their current offensive coordinator, twice. And the second interview was over 5 hours long, or it was reported to be over 5 hours long. So I think he might be a front runner there. And to me, I have to think, I don't think he's a horrible candidate. Obviously, he knows the system. He knows the Jones family well, which I think is the most important thing to the Jones family. But I think, like, is Jerry trying to outsmart everybody again by trying to find a diamond in the rough or something instead of going for a more established candidate? That's kind of the perception I'm getting there. What are your thoughts on the Cowboys head coaching search?
I think when you look at Brian Schottenheimer, I said this in a tweet a couple years ago, kind of got roasted for it at the time, but with Kellen Moore being in the building, I said a comparable, I believe, offensive play caller would be Kellen Moore and Joe Lombardi in regards to Brian Schottenheimer. And his work, I mean, it speaks for itself. This is a guy that helped Mark Sanchez get the 2 straight AFC championship games and actually look like a competent quarterback. And then he had a brief stint with the Rams. And before he left, or after he left, is when you had the abysmal Jeff Fisher and Jared Goff year. And he was able to keep that offense afloat, whether it was Sam Bradford or the backup at the time, because Bradford struggled to stay healthy. And then when you look at his time in Seattle with Russell Wilson, allowing him to cook within that structure, he's done a lot of good work, but he's worked with a lot of average quarterbacks. And so we haven't seen him at the helm with a guy like Dak, with a guy that is deemed to be a top 10 quarterback currently in the league. And because he has repertoire with the Cowboys, he's been with them a couple years. They are true to their people. We saw it with Jason Garrett. That's why they're bringing Kellen Moore in for interviews. They like their guys. And because the front office isn't having any turnover or change, I think they're okay taking this process slowly and not rushing into it. I think they understand that doing that would probably be more detrimental. Now, does that mean Brian Schottenheimer's the guy? I don't know, but I will say I think his body of work speaks for itself, and he'd at least be a good bridge coach or stopgag for a year or two while you're trying to pivot and find the head coach of the future.
And one thing about the Cowboys too is that they give their coaches time, right? We got to remember back to Jason Garrett. He was, I think, 8 years. It's either 6 or 8 years. Mike McCarthy, the full term, the full 4 years before they decided to make a decision. And so if they want a guy they're familiar with, you have to imagine that Schottenheimer, I don't think he'll be a stopgap coach. He'll get a good 2, 3, 4 year run if he ends up being the guy. We'll have to see on that front, though, because there's still no news out of Dallas. They're kind of keeping it quiet.
Yeah, no, and I don't think until they're set on the guy, we're going to really know. But I think they're also waiting for this weekend to play out. If the Eagles lose against the Commanders, I think at that point, that's a pivot point to then go and interview him. And maybe they have a 8-hour interview with him while they break down kind of the discussions of the future of the Dallas Cowboys. So with that being said, it is very interesting that we are talking about the Dallas Cowboys, and 2 of their division rivals are the teams going at it in the NFC Championship game, and the Washington Commanders and the Philadelphia Eagles. And the Commanders, their head coach, Dan Quinn, the defensive coordinator for the Cowboys last year, and then the Philadelphia Eagles offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore, was the Dallas Cowboys coordinator 2 years ago. So a lot of ties back to Dallas that we find here in the NFC Championship game. And it's the 5th time since 2000 that we've seen two teams from the same division meet in the conference championship game. What are your initial thoughts on this matchup? They split during the regular season. Do you see it going one way or the other as we head into Philadelphia?
I think it's a really close matchup, to be quite honest with you. And to the point that you mentioned, the two teams from the same division meeting each other only for the fifth time this century. All four of the teams that won that meeting would go on to win the Super Bowl. So this is a big game if we're going to follow trends here. Obviously, those games were Rams and Niners back in 21. We saw the Rams beat the Bengals. Seahawks and Niners in 2013. Seahawks beat the Broncos. Packers and Bears in 2010. Packers beat the Steelers. And then back in 08, the Steelers beat the Ravens. And then the Steelers would go on to beat I think that was the Cardinals. I don't remember if that was the Cardinals or the Seahawks. That was the
Cardinals in 08. No,
yeah,
that
Seahawks
was
was 06, right? Yeah.
Seahawks was 2005.
It was
technically February 06, but yeah.
But yeah, so that the point is, if you win this game, you got a really good chance. And I think the teams are pretty evenly matched, honestly, because I think how far Jaden Daniels elevates his talent can put them on the star power talent that the Eagles have. To me, it's going to come down to Saquon, as it always does with big games for them. I think if we get another cold game matchup, not sure that the Commanders front is going to be enough to stop Saquon from running rampant. That's like the key to me. And then on defense for the Eagles, how can they disrupt Jaden Daniels? Because he is skinny like a toothpick, but we saw him make plays. He stiff-armed Kalijah Kancey, who is smaller for a defensive player, but is still probably, 80 pounds heavier than Jaden Daniels. He's a tough guy. He'll make the play. So I think the front, the front seven, which is a little bit banged up, is going to have to try to contain and pressure Jaden Daniels if the Eagles want to win.
I think you're absolutely correct. And the Eagles have the upper hand in the trenches on both the offense and the defensive side. Saquon Barkley's rushed for over 140 yards and 2 touchdowns in both his matchups against the Commanders this year. He's toted the ball over 25 times in both contests. I mean, this is a guy that is force-fed and has production. He breaks off. I think in both games, he had a 40-plus yard touchdown run. And that's what's interesting is, okay, he's going to get his own, whether you stack the box and you try to stop it. And we've seen that with the Commanders this postseason already. Bucky Irving had a phenomenal game in wildcard weekend. Jahmyr Gibbs was explosive last week, and it didn't matter. And that's where I think this battle is going to be a little bit more dependent on the quarterback play. And for me, Jalen Hurts' knee, if he's not a good runner in this game, can't pull it on design runs, some of those read options, they're hesitant on some of the tush pushes with him. And if he can't scramble, this is a guy that struggles to deliver accurate on-time throws in the pocket, even with having guys like A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith on the outside. And my concern is even though they went up 14-0, had a 2-possession lead for most of the game the last time they played the Commanders in Washington, and had 5 turnovers, this seems like if they get down 14-0, I am very hard-pressed to believe that Jalen Hurts in this current iteration of the Eagles offense can rally back and win. And so for me, I don't think the Commanders make near the mistakes that they made the last time these two teams played. And right now, if the Eagles can't get out of their own way and move the ball effectively, score points, this is going to be a long day in Philadelphia.
Well, and you talk about them having a 2-score lead the last time these two teams played. The Eagles had a 2-score lead in the last game they played versus the Rams, and the Rams almost came storming back. It just came down to Stafford chucking up a fried turkey leg into the stands instead of delivering the ball to Puka and giving them a chance. So the Eagles are certainly susceptible to giving away leads. We saw it in that game. And then versus the Commanders, we saw them actually lose the game. So I think this could be a very, very close matchup. I think when you bring up the Lions and Buccaneers, the last two teams that the Washington Commanders played, I think the Eagles defense is a bit better than both of those teams. But Quinyon Mitchell, if he's not 100%, I think he could be a guy that they pick on or try to if they don't bracket some of the top receivers like McLaurin, the other guys like De'Ami Brown, Jamison Crowder, some of the other guys, Noah Brown, Zacchaeus. I think a lot of the weapons could be a key here because while the Eagles' secondary is supposedly deep, we saw Isaiah Rodgers get picked on in the Rams game. There was one where he had an interception on the Stafford deep pass, but Demarcus Robinson just ripped it from him. So I want to see if the Eagles' defense can hold up against this high-powered Washington offensive attack, because when we talked about the Lions and Commanders game, the preview game, I was like, I don't know if Washington can go band for band with the Lions. I don't know if they can score 40 plus or whatever. And they did. They scored 45, 38 if you don't want to count the pick six. So they can certainly score. The Eagles defense has to be up to the job of keeping them from not scoring 38 or 40 or whatever it is. And for me, that's going to be the overall key. I know you're concerned about Jalen Hurts' knee, but he did rattle off the 45-ish yard rushing touchdown. He did look a little bit slow there, but he was able to shake off a couple tackles and make it in. So I'm not super concerned. However, it's just going to come down to the Eagles' defensive front for me. They have to contain and pressure Jaden Daniels. If they do that, I think they walk away with the win. But I would love to see Jaden Daniels as a rookie take his team to the Super Bowl.
So Samuel Cosme, he goes out. He is done for the year last week. I think he got bent back on his leg, probably ended up tearing something. I'm sure that report is out there exactly what specific, the injury specific details. But in regards to that interior presence, they got stopped the last time they played the Eagles at midfield on a 4th and short, and they decided to try to run it up the gut. And I think when we've seen this team go for it on 4th down, you need to have Jaden Daniels in shotgun. You either need to get vertical with it or you need to have a quick passing play. And then when you look back at that last time these two teams played, Brian Robinson, 2 fumbles. De'Ami Brown, 1 fumble. Jaden Daniels, he threw 2 picks on drives where you could have gone and taken the lead. And so those are errors and miscues from this offense the last go round that I think they're going to clean up. This is a team that the last 2 times they played the Eagles, they punted at least twice. Up to this point in the playoffs, they've punted once. Now, I do think they'll punt. I don't think they're going to have the number of turnovers, but this is an offense that can score, and it can score in a hurry. You brought up some of the weapons that they've had. Jaden Daniels hit a beautiful deep bomb to De'Ami Brown in this game, or the last time these two teams played in week 16, which helped them to come back. I think the difference between the first and second matchup is that they were force feeding Terry McLaurin. They had a couple screens where they were trying to get him going, and then they hit a kind of like go ball to the end zone that allowed them to get back in the game. I think it made it 14-7. Then Saquon busts a 70-yard rushing touchdown to make it 21-7. And again, the fact that the Commanders were able to claw back into this game makes me believe that as long as they have opportunistic play on the defensive side, which they've gotten, the other thing to consider on the defensive side, Lattimore had some success against A.J. Brown the last 2 times these team played. He obviously had a lot of PI calls, and A.J. Brown came down with a couple catches, but A.J. Brown from a yak standpoint was limited. I think that allows you to then put your star Mike Sandstrill, who's a rookie, by the way, out of Michigan, on Devontae Smith. And when you want to get into cover 1 and dare Jalen Hurts to throw, I think this is the defense to do it. When they've played the Eagles, this Dan Quinn defense has played cover 1 on 66% of the snaps. On the year when they haven't played the Eagles, they've played cover 1 at a rate of 44%. So this is a defense that is going to try to load up and stop the run, keep that median gain minimal, and you know he's going to get his. Saquon's probably going to get a big one when a double team works. You have a guy like who's their right guard that came from the Jets. Why am I blanking out on the tackle's name? Turn guard, Mekhi Becton.
Yeah.
If he does what he did against the Rams, where you're able to just pancake a guy, and you have Jordan Mailata running as a free blocker, like you might have an instance where that happens against this defense. But the other thing that the Commanders did not have in either matchup against the Eagles was Jonathan Allen, who I believe either tore his pec or bicep early on in the year. And so now you have him, Daron Payne, the rookie Johnny Newton. On the defensive line, you have Frankie Louvu, who's typically on the strong side of the formation. You have Dante Fowler, Dorrance Armstrong. Like, you have guys on that defensive line that if they can just make a couple plays, a tackle for loss here, a sack there, you're able to force a fumble, force an errant throw that turns into an interception. that's what's going to catapult you to a victory. And so I think when you look at the dynamic of these two teams, I'm going to take the team that has the better quarterback and the guy that I know I can trust, and not a quarterback that's kind of been forgettable play-wise in these first two matchups against offenses and teams that are pretty banged up or devoid of talent.
Yeah, the Eagles, and you're talking about the rate that the Commanders play cover one against this team. They're going to need Hurts to beat them. Like, that's what it's going to have to come down to. I don't know if Washington's going to end up with 4 interceptions again, like they had against the Lions, but we'll have to see, because they do have opportunistic defenders on that back end. I'm falling back on the level of talent across the board for these teams. And to me, I think the Eagles are just a bit higher. They don't have to depend on Hurts entirely, like you said, because Saquon can do that kind of stuff. AJ Brown can high point and beat these people. Like, they have the players to do this. And you talked about how stout the Commanders' D-line is. They're going up against the best O-line. So it's like a fair matchup there, at least. So I'm leaning a little bit toward the Eagles. I want the Commanders to win. I want to see something different, but they're just going to have to prove it to me. I don't know. I guess I still have hesitations about some stuff about their, like Cliff Kingsbury, their right tackle, now being out for the year. There's just some things nagging at me, but hopefully we get a good game there. The next game that we'll see, which is the last game before the Super Bowl, I think we know will be a good game, because they typically are good games when these two teams match up in the postseason. It's Buffalo going to Kansas City again. Seems like every year we see this. The only times we haven't seen it is when the Bengals rattled off a couple wins. But yeah, it's Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes in the postseason again. I think this is the 4th or 5th time that they're meeting in the postseason. Overall, I know that in the last 10 games, the Bills and Chiefs are 5-5. Both teams have scored exactly 251 points in those 10 games. It's a fair matchup when you look back, like, I guess, calendar dates with games, but when you go to the postseason, it skews in favor of the Chiefs. So how are the Bills going to try to rectify that and get it skewed like slightly back toward them in terms of the overall record?
This gives off big brother, little brother vibes, where, there will be that time where the big brother isn't trying as hard. And that's the regular season Chiefs. And little brother comes in, they throw their best shot, and they come away with the victory. Well, when big brother is actually trying, aka the Chiefs in the playoffs, they take care of business, they find a way. And I think in this case in point, this is back-to-back seasons where Andy Reid faces a former protege in the AFC Championship game. Last year it was John Harbaugh and the Ravens. This year it's Sean McDermott and the Bills. And what's interesting is both of those guys coached on the defensive side of the ball in Philadelphia for Andy Reid. Sean McDermott specifically coached under Steve Spagnuolo at one point. And so it's very interesting when you look at kind of the dynamics of this game and how they're both going to approach it. I do think the Bills have an advantage. I think they can get bigger at the line of scrimmage. The Chiefs have struggled against tight ends in the passing game this year. And when Dalton Kincaid back, who didn't play in the first matchup, I think that gives you an extra added kind of edge in this game, so to speak. And then Josh Allen and James Cook, the running back duo, has formed a really, really good way to pair with this kind of, I would say, hodgepodge wide receiving core. You have guys that are good at very specific things. You trade for Amari Cooper, who can win one-on-one reps, had 2 great catches against the Chiefs in the last go round. Khalil Shakir, your yak guy, your security blanket underneath. And then Curtis Samuel, who has made some really good plays after the catch. And I think as long as those guys are contributing, you have a successful run game and you don't get in your own way. You don't make any mistakes, just like they did against Baltimore. You let the Chiefs make the mistakes. I think that's how you open the window to make a Super Bowl run. I think if they get too cute, Joe Brady, this moment's too big for him, similar to it was too big for Todd Monken and the Ravens last year. I think that's what opens the door for the Chiefs to capitalize on the Bills' mistakes. Now, I don't know if there's some form of devil magic that goes on. This was a one possession game for most of, I think, the week. It was either week 11. I think it was week 11 that these two teams played. But it was one of those situations where it's in Buffalo. You could argue the Bills had an advantage because the Chiefs were the undefeated team. You were chasing them. That monkey's off the Chiefs' back. They aren't dealing with an undefeated season. And I think they know what they have to do to win this game. My question to you is, who do the Chiefs attack? Because they have a lot of different playmakers. They have Hollywood Brown back. How do they get their offense going so they can go band for band with Josh Allen and the Bills?
They attack everybody on that back end. We saw in the high points last week with Lamar Jackson, when he was able to buy time in the pocket, the downfield opened up for him, and he was able to dice him, whether it was Mark Andrews before he would fumble, Rashad Bateman, or Isaiah Likely, who had quite the day. And you look at the Chiefs, well, they have Travis Kelce, who, like looking at last week, looks rejuvenated. They got Xavier Worthy involved early last week. He had that really huge up-in-the-air catch. Hollywood Brown is healthy this time. They have Isaiah Pacheco back, who doesn't look great, but at least he's a guy who can pound the rock and spell Kareem Hunt when they need it. I think that Andy Reid's plan is going to be to utilize everybody, because if we're talking about buying time in the pocket, who does that better than Patrick Mahomes? And I think the Chiefs O-line, I have questions with it. I have questions with Thuney being left tackle if he plays left tackle. I have questions with if it's DJ Humphries or Wanya Morris. I think that side of the line is a little sus, but the interior on the right side is pretty strong. And if Jawan Taylor's allowed to false start, he gets in his sets pretty quickly, and nobody's going to disrupt him if he gets there a step early. So I think the Chiefs have a plan for him. They always do. And I think that we're going to see some
My question to you
stuff.
is, though, from and you've watched film, you know who DJ Humphries is. Wanya Morris isn't the best left tackle, but at what point does a backup left guard who's worse than the guy that you're throwing at left tackle make up for that? Because for me, I'd rather have an elite left guard and then chip and help that left tackle rather than having an above average left tackle and probably a replacement level left guard.
Well, I think them moving Joe Thuney out there has to mean that Wanya Morris, DJ Humphries, whoever else they've tried there is just so beyond replacement level that they can't get production from them. And at that point, it's like, yeah, I would rather have an average left tackle, someone that can actually get out and get space, keep my pocket wide, than have a strong interior and a guy that's just going to collapse every single time. Like, there has to be some level of adequacy at that tackle position. We saw it for years in Carolina when they would try and get guys like Matt Khalil. They signed him to a big deal, and he was very below replacement level. And then who did they drafted? Greg Little, and then it was Dennis Daly, a 6th round pick, and Russell Okung and Cam Irving, just a list of people that weren't even average starters. They were below average, and we saw how that would tank quarterback production when they weren't at their best, because anything that wasn't their best was horrible. And so I think that's what the Chiefs are dealing with when they decide to put their all-pro left guard out there at tackle. I think that's what they have to be seeing. And then when it comes to we were talking about who they're going to attack on the Bills defense, I think you got to look at the safeties. I think DeBar Hamlin's a really hard hitter, but I'm not going to be super thrilled if I'm asking him to cover Xavier Worthy one play who can roast him, and then DeAndre Hopkins the next play that can moss him. I know he had the pick in the Ravens game last week, but I think that was really on Lamar Jackson. It wasn't his fault, but he got rushed really early by Matt Milano, so he couldn't see where the corner route was developing and just kind of threw it up there. I don't think Mahomes is going to make mistakes like that. We haven't seen him do that in quite some time. So I think the safeties is where you attack if you're the Chiefs. Then on the other side, you talked about how the Bills have a diverse cast of weapons. I think the Chiefs have a diverse defense that's ready to keep them at bay. I think Trent McDuffie is locked and loaded and ready. Like we talked about last week, they get Jalen Watson back to help him. Both of their safeties, Brian Cook and Justin Reed, got banged up in the Texans game, but I don't think we have a designation for them in this game. Both of those guys can cover and are hard hitters. And then you talk about their front. Chris Jones, dominant. Look at what their front did against the Texans. And I'm not going to say that the Bills' O-line is as bad as the Texans was, but they were killing that Texans O-line. They were getting pressure almost every single play. Like we talked about, it was the most or highest pressure to sack rate in 25 years in the postseason. They know how to get after him. And I think if they can disrupt Josh Allen, kind of get him out of his element, because since Joe Brady's taken over, Josh Allen's really been in his element. He's cut down on the mistakes. He's played within the system and hasn't had to be Superman. He just, like, they have him run QB sneaks and stuff. He doesn't have to go super crazy. If they can disrupt him, get him into that Superman mode where he's prone to making mistakes, I think that's the key here. And I think they have the capacity to do that.
We'll see. I think the difference between the Bills offensive line and the Texans offensive line is night and day. I mean, that's just between, you look at pressures, you look at sacks, you look at any of the other advanced metrics, whether it be from ESPN, PFF, SIS, like the Bills have a top 5 unit. And that's a large reason why they've been as successful as they have been post Stephon Diggs. And so when you look at that, you look at the conglomerate of the wide receiving core that they have. I'm not exactly sure if Jalen Watson played in that first matchup, but the Bills are getting Keon Coleman and Dalton Kincaid back as wide receivers. And this was a team that already put up 30 points against this Chiefs defense. And they aren't really necessarily getting a lot of guys back. Their linebackers struggle in coverage. And so I think that there is a good game plan for the Bills offense to score. I think it's going to come down to whether or not the Chiefs can match and go drive for drive, shot for shot. Because if the Bills are able to steal a possession and they build a 2-possession lead, I think it's going to be very hard for this Chiefs team to come back. What is interesting, though, is Xavier Worthy had a really good game the first time these two teams played. This is a guy that has a lot of speed, played very well in that divisional game against the Houston Texans. And we've seen how speed has affected Bills defenses in the past, with Tyreek Hill having some very iconic moments in the postseason against this team. So I would keep an eye out on that. And the other thing is Reed has had a couple weeks to game plan. I don't think he threw some of his best play calls in last week's game because he knew that he was either going to have to play the Bills or the Ravens this week. And so the last time they played the Bills, they had a really, really cool tight end screen. And it's different wrinkles like that I think they're going to build off of in film. It was one, the Noah Gray, where they have, I think, James Cook coming out of the backfield and Noah Gray's blocking Von Miller. Releases, you have 3 offensive linemen, you have all the outside defenders setting the edge, expecting James Cook to get the ball, and you're able to flip it to Noah Gray and he picks up 15, 20 yards. So that kind of dynamic where you're able to get the ball to some of these secondary and tertiary weapons in creative ways in space to where they can make plays and take some of the load and pressure off Mahomes having to drop back and scan the field and make reads and find the open guy, because Sean McDermott is going to throw his best punch. Will it mean anything at the end of the day? I don't think so. I would expect that this is a very high-scoring affair if they start going band for band, similar to what we saw in the divisional round a couple years ago that led to the infamous 13-second meme.
Let me ask you something. Last week, do you think the Bills win if they get, let's say, 1 instead of the 3 turnovers where they got the ball at either midfield or deep inside the Ravens territory?
Well, when you start laying it out like that, if they're pressed, the Ravens start scoring more, I don't think the Bills are necessarily as conservative on offense. Now, maybe that means the Bills make a couple of mistakes and the Ravens run away with it. But I think when you start getting into those arguments, the Bills are equipped to get into a shootout. Unless the Chiefs are just waiting to explode in the playoff mode we've seen them do in the past, I don't think from what we've seen so far up to this point, they can go band for band with the Bills. I think the Bills can go band for band with the Chiefs. So I think when we talk about expectations for offensive production, the Chiefs are the one that have the burden of proof right now in their corner. And all they have is past precedents that they have done this, but we haven't seen them unlock it yet quite so much this year.
I would say that I don't think it was the Bills being as conservative as much as it was the Ravens defense hunkered down and stopped them in the red zone in the second half. And they had to attempt field goals. And so my follow-up to that would be, do you think the Chiefs are going to give them the ball 3 times in such a manner where the Bills have 3 drives that start at the 50 or within, like such advantageous spots? Do you think they're going to have those 3 opportunities?
I mean, the first pass attempt Mahomes had in their first matchup was an interception.
Right.
So the fact that there could be turnovers or high variance outcomes, there was at one point the Bills had a special teams return, a punt return that got them inside Kansas City territory. I think they were about at the 40-yard line, and they were up 6 points. You have the ability to make it a 2-score game. And Josh Allen then throws his interception. So there are elements to where I think this team is going to have good starting position at different points, whether if it's because of turnovers or special teams. The Bills are a really, really well-built team. And so I don't want to take anything away from them. They have good players on the defensive line and the offensive line. We haven't really seen a Chiefs offensive line this bad since that Buccaneers Super Bowl loss. And so when you think about that, you look at the pieces that the Bills have to work with on the defensive line and guys like Von Miller, Ed Oliver, Gregory Rousseau, guys that can get after the quarterback and make plays. And we've seen Von Miller make plays in the postseason. He had a third down sack in the first matchup. So expect big plays from this defensive line. I don't know if there's going to be enough juice on this offense. Is Hollywood Brown stretching enough? Is Juju Smith getting as much yak as he possibly can? Kelsey, as slow as he is he still making magic happen on the back end? And Matt Milano's playing in this game. He didn't play the first go round. So just a lot to break down with this matchup. We could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but how do you ultimately see this playing out as we're wrapping up the conference championship preview?
You can you go through the Chiefs receivers again that you were talking about that you think like that aren't like the you're like, if Hollywood Brown does this, if all that happened,
okay,
like they're not super different.
So they have DeAndre Hopkins, who had a couple good catches in the first round. The first time these two teams played, they have Hollywood Brown, who's back from injury. They have Juju Smith-Schuster. They have Xavier Worthy. And then when you look at tight ends, they have Travis Kelce, Noah Gray. Those are probably your biggest playmakers. They do have Pacheco back. Kareem Hunt has been critical in short yardage situations. But to me, it goes back to the offensive line. Like, do they have truly an elite playmaker at a skill position? And I'm not saying the Bills do either, but Josh Allen had an MVP season. Patrick Mahomes arguably hasn't.
All right. So my point about the receivers would be last year we said the same thing, and their starting receivers were Sky Moore, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, and rookie Rashee Rice. So I'm not super concerned about
Rashee Rice came on at the end of last year, though, and he was
still
like
a rookie
before the injury.
Still a rookie.
Fair enough.
Just like Xavier Worthy. Yeah, I knew it was a stub before the injury. RIP, my fantasy team, because of that. Anyway, I think you're right. This should be a banger of a game. Hopefully both of these games are, but I could see the first game getting out of hand if the Eagles offense doesn't step up to the plate.
Both times the Commanders and Eagles have played this year, it's been a one-score game, and Saquon's going to get his. Like I have no doubt about that. So I think that's going to be a good game. And then when you look at this Bills-Chiefs matchup, I mean, they've been bangers in the postseason. I mean,
yeah,
the divisional round matchup last year in Buffalo, then a couple years ago in Kansas City. I mean, it has always been get your popcorn and enjoy some of the best 3 hours you're going to watch. So I'm excited for that matchup. I don't think either game is going to disappoint, but I could see how some of the matchups between the winners of these two games could make for a lousy Super Bowl. So I had a quick question before we get into Purrfect Takes. What would be your ideal Super Bowl matchup? Regardless of who you think is going to win, who would you love to see playing each other this February?
What I would love to see is, like I talked about earlier, I'd love to see a rookie, Jaden Daniels, take his team to the top. Not only just taking his team there, but this was a team that was owned by one of the worst owners we've seen in professional sports, or at least in the NFL. And a year removed from them, taking them to the Super Bowl rather, and winning would be awesome. And I would want them to do it against the highest of the high, against the Chiefs, ruining their three-peat. It would be the first three-peat ever in the Super Bowl era, not counting the Packers Mickey Mouse one, right, as the Super Bowl runs started. But that would be awesome, right? To like the little guy taking down the big guy at the top. But I think, and I'm getting into my perfect take here, but I think we're going to have a similar situation to last season's Final Four. When we talked about these games last year, do you remember I was like, oh man, it would be awesome to see Lamar Jackson, who's the MVP right now, He has the Mike McDonald, defense on his team. Them go against the Lions, who are the best offense, and they have a really strong defense this year.
We saw that though last year, and it was
we did. It
a
was
snoozer of a game.
It was, but I thought it would have been fun in the Super Bowl.
That's fair.
I don't know, the first Lions Super Bowl and maybe ever. I don't know, but it didn't happen. We ended up with a repeat. I was like, oh my god, a repeat, and it turned out to be a good game at the end there. It even went into overtime. That game, we ended up with the Chiefs and Niners. So as much as I want the Commanders to go in and beat up the Chiefs, and I think it's in New Orleans this year, the Super Bowl. I think, and this is my perfect take for the week, I think we're going to get another repeat. I think we're going to end up with Chiefs versus Eagles, unfortunately. And that's just how it's going to be. We're going to get disappointed for a second year in a row. Like we were talking about it, right? How it's like the Bills versus the Ravens. Oh, this is such a good game. And the Chiefs are just going to come in and wreck it. I think that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think they've loved every aspect of flying underneath the radar as the two-time defending Super Bowl champ. They haven't had all eyes on them because of the MVP debate between the Bills and the Ravens and Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. And so I think it's very fascinating that we get now the same situation we've had the past 7 years, and that's the Chiefs in the Final Four. And my take, I'm going to modify my Tuesday take. I still have the Commanders winning this week. I think they represent the NFC in the Super Bowl. However, I'm hesitant in saying that they're the only away team that's going to win this weekend. I can see the Bills winning, but I don't see them winning in regulation. And the only quarterback that has beaten Patrick Mahomes in the postseason in regulation is Tom Brady. I don't think that changes. I think if Josh Allen wins, this game has to go to overtime in the night game. In prime time. I think this is going to be one of the most legendary games we see. I'm not predicting overtime. I'm just saying Patrick Mahomes does not lose this game in regulation.
So he doesn't lose in regulation as your take. All right.
Yeah. This happened against the 49ers. Right. They lost in overtime last year. Brock Purdy may have beaten him, but he would have joined Joe Burrow in beating him in overtime. Tom Brady is the only guy to end it in regulation against Patrick Mahomes, which is scary to think about. Him and Jaden Daniels, I guess, at this point, since Jaden Daniels is 2-0. But
and Brady did it in overtime too. In New England when they went to the Super Bowl against the Rams. It's funny, right? How eventually we're going to have the Tom Brady versus Mahomes debates, how we have the Michael Jordan versus LeBron James debates, and it's going to bring up, well, Tom Brady was 2-0 against Mahomes in the postseason, and that's always going to be a talking point for them. And yeah, you brought it up.
Mahomes even brought that up. He said, I can't be thrown in that GOAT discussion. I think this was after last year's Super Bowl win, but he's like, Brady has that hanging over me. He beat me in the Super Bowl. Like, you can't get any clearer than that.
I don't know if Mahomes gets a three-peat this year and then a couple more. We'll have some stuff to talk about. And then, you brought it up. Joe Burrow beats him in overtime. I think it was the third time ever, because the Drew Brees Saints lost, that the team that gets the ball first loses. You remember the Chiefs got the ball first, and Mahomes, there was an interception. The Bengals drive down and win it. The Chiefs were really bad in that second half of the game anyway, but I like that. I think that if the Bills have to dethrone the Chiefs, it will have to go to overtime. The overtime rules that they were the ones that kind of, I don't want to say cried for, but they were making a big fuss about, hey, we need to change the rules.
Overtime needs to be more like college. Let's be
real. I
real.
agree. I'm not saying they were wrong, but I'm saying they were the ones who started it.
Yeah.
I imagine it goes to overtime and the Chiefs win because of the new rule. That would be funny, but I digress. So I think we both have actually, you don't have the Chiefs winning. You just say Patrick Mahomes isn't going down in the first 60 minutes. He's not going down in the first 9 rounds is the point you want to bring up. I have my picks as the Chiefs and Eagles as much as I want the Commanders to win. And you pick the Commanders. So
you'll be a believer after this weekend, because just like what we talked about, this is the 5th time we've seen division rivals play in the championship game. And what's interesting is when you look at all of those different matchups. So go back to 2021. You have Matthew Stafford versus Jimmy G. Who's the better quarterback? Stafford's the better quarterback. We go to 2013. I think this is probably the closest one here. Colin Kaepernick or Russell Wilson?
Yeah, I'm going
Like,
Kaepernick. Yeah, like
okay, that's fair.
I'm a Russ hater, so.
And no, and he was, and Colin Kaepernick
But
right there at
Russ
the end
had like
had
the
the
best,
ability to
one of
win
the
it.
best defenses of all time as well.
He did. Yeah. So the next one, you have Aaron Rodgers and the Packers going to play Jay Cutler and the Bears. And this one, I think, is the one for comparison because I would say Jaden Daniels is going on an Aaron Rodgers type run this postseason.
Yeah, I could see it. I mean, the efficiency we're seeing, the accuracy, the poise, it's very Rodgers-like. So I could see that a lot. Obviously, I'm
And then
picking
'08,
Rodgers in that matchup.
yeah. And then in '08, you have rookie Joe Flacco, who, don't get me wrong, had one of the most magical postseason runs back in 2012. But he went up against Big Ben, who had already won a Super Bowl, was a veteran, had already swept the Ravens that year. Who do you think was probably the better quarterback
Yeah,
in that matchup? So
Big Ben.
that's, I think, what it comes down to is Jaden Daniels is the better quarterback, and that's what matters in these situations. And that's what I think is going to determine who plays representing the NFC. And like you said, all those teams who won those division matchups then went on to win the Super Bowl.
Well, let's hope so. Hopefully, it makes for a good game. That's going to do it for us this week. On Tuesday, we'll be back to talk about what happened, and probably some team will hire a coach, so we'll talk about that too. We'll obviously have like the gap week until the Super Bowl, so we'll probably talk about some draft stuff. But until then, enjoy the championship matchup games this weekend. Stay safe and keep pounding.